For the Daily Princetonian, I'm Marie-Rose Sheinerman, and today I have the privilege of speaking with two renowned scholars, Professor Robert George and Professor Cornel West. Professor George is a foremost leader in American conservative thought. At the university, he's the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence in the Politics Department and the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. Professor West holds 2 Princeton graduate degrees in philosophy and is the class of 1943 University Professor Emeritus. Welcome, and thank you both so much for speaking.
Pleasure to be with you, Marie-Rose.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, as a jumping off point for our discussion, I was hoping we could use the Boston Globe piece on honesty and courage that the two of you co-authored last week, where you called on President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden to model those qualities at this difficult moment for our nation. To start, I'm wondering if each of you could briefly share what motivated you write this piece. Are there any specific events or trends that led you to say, honesty and courage are the only hope now? Professor George, could I start with you?
Yes, Professor West and I have been working together, teaching together, beginning at Princeton before he abandoned us, Marie-Rose, to go to Harvard over my strong objections since 2007, I think. And we've been, of course, watching events in the country as we've increasingly become a polarized people. We've been observing with first a sense of concern and now a sense of alarm the way citizens are treating each other, not as fellow citizens who disagree, but as enemies, enemies to be not only defeated but destroyed. And we both recognize just from our study of history and from the great philosophical texts that we've taught together, for example, and that have been so influential in our own intellectual lives, we recognize that a Republican democracy cannot survive extreme factionalization, polarization, the collapse of what's called civic friendship, what Lincoln called the bonds of affection that unite people despite their disagreements as fellow citizens and commit them more deeply to the democratic process by which we resolve our differences, not by force of arms or anything like that, but rather by deliberation, discussion, and debate, carefully preserving the values and virtues, the principles that are necessary as conditions for democratic deliberation, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. And Cornel and I, whatever differences we may have on political matters, are deeply united on the importance of those fundamental civil liberties as the conditions for the flourishing of a Republican democracy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Should I respond, Sister Rose?
If you have anything to add, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I mean, I fundamentally agree with my dear brothers. So both as citizens, as human beings, as Christians, even though we have political and ideological disagreements, we have deep, profound coming together in communion as brothers and as Princetonians. I mean, and as Princetonians, really. And so it was a blessing to be able to work with him on this. And in some ways, it was a response to what was going on in both society, but also with Princeton. When we were, I think I'd given you a call, all right, Brother Robbie?
You did, that's right. I was blessed to hear from
said,
you, and you were concerned.
When we were talking about, when they shifted the name of Woodrow Wilson, I said, oh, we put forward that argument in 1974 when I was a graduate student. But I'm concerned with the validity of the argument, the force of the reasons, not just a matter of a declaration from above just as an act of power, rather than some democratic deliberative process, so that it actually has a legitimacy in the heart and minds of people in the community. And so when we discovered that Brother Chris and the others really had not allowed for the kind of faculty consultation, I wanted to make sure that when you engage in that kind of decision, that it rests deep in the hearts and minds and souls of the community. It's not just something that happens from on high because it's viewed somehow much more just a power move rather than a Socratic process in which people realize these are the reasons why Brother Woodrow Wilson is in fact being removed. He's got some positive things in terms of his support of graduate school, his positive things in terms of him leading Princeton through some very tough times, and at the same time, a whole host of negative things in terms of his racism, in terms of his imperial sensibilities. Robbie's got his critique of the administrative state and expansionism of the nation state and so forth and so on that we can talk about. But it's a matter of also staying in contact with the humanity, even of a brother like Woodrow Wilson. So we can agree with the conclusion. We want integrity in the process. We don't want to send the message to our students that somehow Socratic dialogue does not have a fundamental role and function. It's just a matter of power being pushed around X, Y, and Z.
So when Cornel suggested that we do something to speak to this current crisis, which is so alarming across the country, I immediately said, well, of course we have to do that. But we begin with this statement of this question of how do we deal with the past. So if you'll excuse me, let me just read you, it's very brief, the two relevant paragraphs. First, we need the honesty and courage to honor the contributions of the great men and women who have come before us, those who articulated and defended true principles of justice and the common good, built or helped to preserve worthy institutions, and modeled important virtues. But then that is immediately followed by a paragraph referring to the same people. And here's how it reads. We need the honesty and courage to recognize the faults, flaws, and failings of even the greatest of our heroes, and to acknowledge our own faults, flaws, and failings. What Cornel and I are pleading with our fellow citizens to do here is to join us in avoiding what might be called the flaw or the error of presentism, subjecting the great figures of the past who did make important contributions, who did model important virtues, to standards that we ourselves could never conceivably meet, no human being could meet. All of us are, in important ways, men and women of our times. We are going to be partially shaped. There's no one in the 20th century that Brother Cornel and I would hold up and honor more than Martin Luther King. Why? Because he stood so boldly and courageously and gave his life for the principle that all men and women are brothers and sisters under the fatherhood of God. He treated the Declaration of Independence as a great promissory note, I'm using his own language here, as a promissory note of liberty and justice for all, which we need to make good on, that he was calling to be paid. And yet we also know from the work of David Garrow and others, the great historian David Garrow and others, that Martin Luther King, like the rest of us frail, fallen, fallible human beings, had faults, some terrible faults, faults involving the terrible mistreatment of women. We don't honor him for those faults when we put up a King Memorial, which we have done and which we should do in Washington, D.C., or when we name a high school, Martin Luther King School, or a plaza, Martin Luther King Plaza. We're honoring him for the great things he did, for the virtues that he did model, such as courage, such as integrity, for his courage in standing firm and his honesty in calling out the country on the promissory note and demanding that the note be repaid. So you see the careful truthfulness that has to be observed here. We need to tell the whole truth. We need to tell the truth. No whitewashing, no villainizing, but it's got to be the whole truth in all its complexity. But I should turn it over to you, Brother Cornel.
I think you're speaking the truth. I think it's fascinating that when Martin Luther King was asked who was the bravest man he ever met, he mentioned a Princetonian. His name was Norman Thomas, class of 1905. He's one of the greatest figures of the 20th century. He was actually a student of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson said he was his finest student. Norman Thomas graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Princeton in 1905, and of course went on to become one of the greatest freedom fighters. And he and Martin were very close in terms of both spirit. And when Martin met him, he said, I just never met a braver man. Why? Because both of them put a primacy on the moral and the spiritual, in terms of witness and in solidarity, of course, with what we also talk about in our piece, the weak, the vulnerable, the poor, the persecuted, no matter where they are. They could be Muslims in China, they could be Dalits in India, they could be Roma in Europe, they could be Jews in Russia or France, and even attacked in Pittsburgh. They could be Palestinians under Israeli occupation. There could be anywhere people are being treated in such a way that many conclude, as I do, and Brother Robbie, I think, would agree, that they deserve a much more just treatment. We begin with self-examination, and then we attempt to unleash the kinds of empathy and love and compassion for our fellow human beings, fellow citizens.
And then another paragraph. We need the honesty and courage to resist the hatred that zeal even for good causes, and this is what Cornel was just talking about, zeal even for good causes can induce in us frail, fallen, fallible human beings. The spirit of hatred corrupts the human soul and leads inexorably to spiritual emptiness and to tyranny, even among those who began as sincere advocates of freedom and justice. Now, in writing these words, Cornel and I are looking back and trying to draw the lessons of the past. Even the noblest and best causes can be occasions for injustice. They can degenerate, and then they discredit the good cause. I think myself of the cause of anti-communism. It's a noble cause. There's no ideology in the history of mankind, correct me if I'm wrong here, Cornel, no ideology in the history of mankind with a higher death toll than communist ideology. If you look at Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, it's unbelievable. And so resisting that, resisting Soviet imperialism and expansionism, standing alongside Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, those who resisted Soviet tyranny, that was a very, very noble cause. And yet, look at how the great cause of anti-communism, standing for freedom and liberty, justice against communism, was corrupted by, for example, Joseph McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, who used it to smear people, to go to an extreme where he was seeing a communist behind every tree, where he was falsely accusing people of crimes they had not committed, where he was using anti-communism to advance his own narrow ideology, and where everything he saw, because it was colored by the lens through which he was looking, would simply reinforce the narrative that he had created and that his supporters had bought into. And so a noble cause was not only corrupted, but to a large extent discredited. So when you hear the words anti-communism today, often people don't think of Adlai Stevenson or John F. Kennedy or Václav Havel or John Paul II or Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If you just hear the words anti-communist, he was an anti-communist, you might think first of Joseph McCarthy. That's how badly McCarthy corrupted and discredited a noble cause. So we need to keep that in mind. No matter what you think the noble cause is, what you're committed to, remember how it can become an occasion of corruption, because there is in all of us a temptation to a kind of zeal and blindness that can lead us astray.
If I could cut in here, thank you so much for those remarks. I'd love to just go back to something you said a short while ago about honoring the greats of the past. And I'm wondering specifically what greats of the past you feel are not being sufficiently or well honored today, and how can students and the Princeton community honor them better? And maybe that goes back to Woodrow Wilson, which you mentioned at the beginning, Professor West, or maybe it doesn't. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Professor West.
Well, when I think of those associated with Princeton, I mean, Toni Morrison comes to mind. She's already got a building. Norman Thomas, as I mentioned before, is just such a towering figure, not to be worshipped. He's not an idol. He was a human being like anybody else. I think we fought to get Norman Thomas a little space in one of the housing units about 20 years ago with Shauna Williams and a few other brothers and sisters. But I would think of a giant like Edward Said. I mean, he's one of the great public intellectuals of the latter part of the 20th century. He was graduated. I think he was in class for about 57 or so. I think he overlapped with Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader is one of the great citizens in that regard. But no, all of those are progressives. But I think you've got some liberals and conservatives who made their own contributions in their respective fields, because you're not talking about persons who meet just a particular litmus test. Now, to the degree to which we recognize that Princeton, like all of the Ivy League schools, like every major institution in America, was deeply grounded in white supremacy and those effects and consequences, of course, they still operate. Brother Robbie and I recognize the degree to which the effects of white supremacy are still reverberating on a variety of different ways, even as we have leadership, Brother Chris and others, who want to fight against it, but we have to be vigilant in that regard. But for me, it's not just a matter of the great ones, my dear sister. It's a matter, I'm concerned about the precious souls and minds and hearts and bodies of our young people, of the students coming through. Not just my own daughter who's in your class at 2020, but all of them. I mean, are they being exposed to the best in terms of virtues?
We keep coming back to this. Reasonable people of goodwill will disagree. We'll disagree about some very fundamental things. We'll certainly disagree about policy matters. Even people who share the same basic convictions as Cornel and I do, for example, the profound inherent and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family as a creature fashioned in the very image and likeness of God, that fundamental Jewish and Christian belief, also shared by some other traditions of faith. We'll nevertheless disagree when it gets down to, okay, now how do we honor that best? What policies are the right policies? In economics, what direction should we go? How much should the market be relied on? How much government intervention is the right amount? How much regulation of the economy? What's too much? What will be counterproductive? These are very, very important questions on which reasonable people of goodwill disagree. Now, one of the things this means is we need to honor viewpoint diversity at Princeton, and I'd so praise Cornel as a person on the progressive side who has been in the forefront, as has Chris Eisgruber, our president, not a conservative by any means, but has been in the forefront of saying we need more conservative voices at Princeton. We need more exposure of our students to the best that has been thought and said in the various conservative traditions. As with progressivism, there's not just one tradition within that broad category. There are many and important ones. Some are in the more libertarian direction, others in the more traditionalist direction. If we go beyond Princeton, there's a figure that is finally starting to get the recognition she deserves. There's an important one to Cornel and me, so important that we singled her out for mention in our statement on honesty and courage, and that's Harriet Tubman. And here I want to tell a little story that Cornel will remember so well. When I was elected chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, I think it was in 2015, Cornel, I wanted to be sworn in. I was going to be sworn in by Chief Justice Roberts to my new role. And I wanted to be sworn in on a historically significant Bible, a Bible that was associated with a great hero of human rights. I thought for my new role, defending international religious freedom, that would be a symbolically valuable thing to do. And then the other important thing to me is I wanted my dear brother Cornel West to hold the Bible. And so I thought, the Bible I'd really like to hold, and I'm sure she must have had one, was the Bible of Harriet Tubman. So I reached out to the Harriet Tubman House in Auburn, New York, a little museum up there on the Underground Railroad, devoted to the life of Harriet Tubman, and having what few possessions she had. She was obviously a poor woman, a former slave, someone not wealthy at all. But among the things she had was a Bible, a quite magnificent, large Bible. And they were thrilled that anybody was interested in Harriet Tubman in those days. Do you remember this, Cornel?
Oh,
they couldn't have been more eager to help. They arranged for the Bible to be shipped down to me, and especially when they learned that Cornel was going to be the person holding it as Chief Justice Roberts swore me in at the Supreme Court. They couldn't have been more excited about it. And so they shipped the Bible down. We took it up to the Supreme Court. Brother Cornel kindly held it for me, which was a great honor for me, and I was sworn in on Harriet Tubman's Bible. I think now, in the last few years, especially because of the movie, she's better known, especially to young people. But because she went through a period, inexplicably to me, of not getting the public recognition she deserved, we don't have a lot of monuments or buildings or institutes or anything like that in her name. And she's a person very worthy of being honored.
Absolutely. And it would be wonderful to our lyrical genius, Kanye West, understood who Harriet Tubman really is. You see, that brother talk about it, she never freed any slaves. I'm running for president. Go back and do your homework. You get your lyrics nice. Read your history, my dear brother. But that's part of the challenge of all fellow citizens. We have to be knowledgeable of the great ones, the level of their sacrifice, the scope of their suffering. They're still human beings, but they become exemplary. And you can't make it through this life from womb to tomb without having certain exemplary figures who inform who you are as a virtuous person with a certain kind of grand vision, whatever religious or non-religious tradition you come from. But that's what Pi Day is all about. Robbie and I talk about this all the time. This is what deep education is all about. This ought to sit at the very center of Princeton at its best. I mean, Princeton will always have its worst because it's inhabited by human beings. And it's still part of the legacy of various kinds of ugly ideologies, but we just have to fortify ourselves to be able to fight it. And that's another reason why I think the arts needs to be more central at Princeton. When Robbie pulls out his banjo and he and I sing a song together, he's in tune, I'm out of tune, but that's all right. I'm bringing in the spirit of Sam Cooke and Luther Vandross and Aretha anyway, and he's playing us into. But there's something about the arts that gets at our humanity in terms of our vulnerability, our invincibility, our need to acknowledge our fallibility. And that, I think that's a challenge for the curriculum in this regard. The poetries that needs to be crucial. You know, thank God for the Tracy Smith. Imani Perry, she's becoming poetic in her prose. James Baldwin, that my dear brother, Eddie Glaude has just written about with such insight. He's an artist, he's a poet. And so Robbie and I recognize the way in which poetry, philosophy, political theory are intertwined in order to stay in contact with our humanity at its deepest level.
I'd love to follow up on that in terms of the study of history and curriculum that you were talking about. There have been a number of calls, both from student and faculty, to, at Princeton, have a distribution requirement for all students, or some students in the policy school, for instance, about the history of marginalized people. Would you see that as a positive change?
My worry about that sort of requirement, especially if it's made a requirement, is the dangers and temptations of us frail, fallen, fallible human beings to politicize and ideologize the curriculum. The curriculum is something precious. We have to avoid its politicization. It's being used to advance any particular agenda. And when people do that, it's not as if they're aware or consciously, at least in some cases, they're not consciously trying to do that. But it is so easy to slip into it, where dissenting voices are not allowed and a certain party line is pushed. There's complexity to human life in all of its dimension, even in the treatment of marginalized people and who counts as the marginalized people and marginalized by whom. Often victims are also perpetrators, and perpetrators are often victims. Those who are victims in one domain become perpetrators in another domain. There's enormous complexity here, and you don't want an ideological lens to color what is presented. So, here I'm very reluctant to go forward with anything that could present that temptation to politicize and ideologize. I'd much rather allow choice and options here, students to make decisions about whether a course looks attractive or not. In fact, in part, that decision might be made by a student on the basis of whether they think the professor or the syllabus is giving the kind of balance and broad representation that's needed to study human affairs, because human affairs are always complicated and complex. So that's my concern there, Marie-Rose, but I'm interested to hear what Cornel says.
Well, I mean, one, I think we had to just be fundamentally committed to the bloodstained and tear-soaked quest for truth. And the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak wherever that suffering is. And when it comes to natural sciences, fundamental quest for truth, but of course they understand it in terms of prediction. So they're concerned about high levels of prediction and making sure you have some control over the present and future in light of the way in which the past has behaved. But truth, capital T, is something no one of us possess. But you would think that in a history department or in an English department or in a comp lit department, that a fundamental commitment to truth would already understand the ways in which race and gender and class and empire have been constituent elements of the human experience. When it comes to the modern experience, similarly so. But there, it becomes a matter of leadership. You have leadership in your departments to understand when you talk about religion, you're not just talking about religion in a certain part of the world, you're talking about religion across the board, every continent and so forth. Do we have the kind of resources and leadership to understand that quest for truth embraces all of us? And when you don't have that, then you get talk about marginalized people, then you get talk about people who are devalued, dishonored, and so forth. And given those realities of being marginalized and dishonored, the quest must still be one of truth. We're concerned about the truth. If Princeton is not concerned about the truth, then tell us and go on about your travel way. But if we're concerned about the truth, it already includes all of us. Let us see the ways in which it does. Let us conduct ourselves in conversations and scientific inquiries and in literary explorations that allows us to understand the complex, the rich, the deep, and in the end, the excellence that we've seen coming out of civilizations across the board. Now, on the ground, what does that mean? That just means that you have to keep the intellectual, you have to keep the Socratic pressures always in place in terms of what kind of conversations are taking place, what kind of paradigms are in place that are rendering too many people invisible, rendering civilizations invisible, rendering people's struggles invisible. But once you lose talk about truth and you lose talk about knowledge, then you just end up again with just power plays.
I want to lay emphasis on what Cornel is saying here because it's so critically important. We understand, we were taught by the people who began what developed into academic institutions. We go back to Plato's Academy. We were taught by the ancient Greek thinkers, the great thinkers of Athens, Plato and Aristotle. We were taught that we understand what a thing is by reference to the end that it seeks, the telos, to use the Greek term. So what is a university? What is a college or university? Well, to understand it, we have to understand its telos, the end it seeks, the thing for which it exists, its constituting purpose. What is that? What Cornel has just told you is so fundamentally important. The telos is truth. That's the end, the goal, the purpose, the defining thing about it. It's what the mission of the institution is. And that means we have to be focused on truth-seeking. And the truth is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable sometimes for me and sometimes for you. There's nobody for whom it's always going to be comfortable. It's going to disrupt our thinking and our comfort. It's going to unsettle us. But we need to be, I would almost say, single-minded. That's going to a little bit too far, but almost single-minded in our pursuit of truth as the thing that the university is all about, and our work as scholars and your work as students is all about. Now, what that means is other important, valuable things that the university can assist in pursuing, and often should assist in pursuing, can never be placed above truth. Truth can never be set aside for them, or the truth-seeking mission of the university can't be set aside for them. Athletics, to take a simple example. Athletics has a role in higher education. I believe in that. I'm glad we have athletic teams, and not just intramural ones, but interscholastic ones. But if athletics gets out of hand and the emphasis and attention given and resources given to athletics begin to undermine the truth-seeking mission of the university, then we're out of whack. Then I have a big problem, rather than being fundamentally focused on truth. Same with the pursuit of justice. Same with the pursuit of justice. That's got a legitimate role in the universities. And we should want our students to be justice seekers, knowing and recognizing they'll have competing different ideas about justice. But even there, it cannot be given priority over truth-seeking. That's when ideology begins to slip in and it corrupts the truth-seeking process and mission of the university. So truth's got to be first. Now, there are some people who believe that the priority of truth-seeking is such, and the vulnerability of truth-seeking is such, that we should abandon the other things altogether. Some people think just drop athletics, or at least interscholastic athletics. Some people think we should dismiss social witness or the pursuit of justice or anything like that because it's too dangerous. Cornel will remember the statement so often made to the two of us by our dear friend Harry Frankfurt, the great philosopher.
Oh, yes. Oh, Brother Harry.
Who used to worry, and he would chide us about being public intellectuals. He had real questions about whether being a public intellectual was a good thing to do. And Cornel will remember the phrase he would often use. He would say, it was almost a slogan, "We are the monks." Remember, we are the monks. We shouldn't be out in the world making a show of ourselves. We shouldn't be out there advocating and protesting and doing things like that. Not because he had anything wrong with the causes to which we were committed or anything to object to, but because he worried that it would take us away from the truth-seeking mission. Now, obviously, Cornel and I have not taken that advice strictly. We've been out there in the world. We've been struggling for justice as we understand justice.
You know, the irony
is exactly the same.
Harry and I, when we were at Yale together, we had planned to teach a course on Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thomas Jefferson. Those were his heroes.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, his heroes are out in the world engaging and trying to change the world in various ways. And yet he himself understood himself in this monkish way in the academy. But in addition to truth, just very quickly, my dear sisters, I think it's very important to accent what Brother Chris, the president, has talked about in terms of mutual respect. That when he talked about how the quest for truth, free speech, independent thinking, Socratic dialogue, so crucial, but there's got to be mutual respect. So that my Zaytun just gave me the piece by my dear brother Joshua Katz, where I liked his stress on independent thinking. I liked his stress on Socratic dialogue. I like the sense that he's trying to broaden the discussion in such a way that we never fall into orthodoxy. Absolutely. But mutual respect has got to be important. And in the case of Brother Katz, his own teacher, his own mentor, probably the greatest linguist of the 20th century in terms of historical analysis, Calvert Watkins, who I used to sit in on his lectures at Harvard. And he was the mentor of Joshua Katz. And he was always somebody who had this empathy. He had this respect for the other, so that the language that he used was always reflective in some sense of how the other would receive what was said in order to touch them, to unsettle them, to have them rethink what they're doing. Because all of us have those moments where what we once said were nonsense, time to rethink, time to be questioned in that regard. So on the one hand, we've got to broaden the discussion. And, you know, Brother Katz broadens it in his own way. I think that's very important. I know that you yourself, Brother Robbie, was concerned about broadening this discussion. But at the same time, you got to make sure you're respecting your interlocutors. You got to make sure that you're empathizing with your conversational partners, so that even the students, you know, when the students took over Brother Chris's office, they called me in Atlanta and I paid their hotel rooms because they were threatened. They were under this death threat, and they ran and they stayed in the rooms with 17 of them. I didn't have money for 17. I say double up. So they doubled up, and I paid along with Sister Monty. Why? Because I didn't view them as local terrorists. I viewed them as engaging in civil disobedience. I told them the Kingian thing. You have to deal with consequences of what you do. No doubt about this. But you feel as if you have exhausted the Socratic options and you're bringing power and pressure to bear, but you're still doing it in a respectful way. You know, you're not going to disrespect Chris as president. you're moving in an act of civil disobedience to say, we tried everything and we think these issues are such that this is what we're doing. But there has to be a level of the moral and spiritual in civic disobedience. But that's radically different than terrorism. And that kind of language that Brother Katz is using has to be called into question, even as we have a serious discussion about making sure a university can be a place where there's a variety of perspectives, variety of visions, variety of arguments, and we look at the validity of them, we look at the quality of them.
I think it's very important to understand what Brother Joshua was saying in its context. He was not saying that there was anything violent in the occupation of Chris Eisgruber's office. What he was concerned about in trying to express in a blunt manner his opposition to was the bullying and the intimidation, the false allegations and the smears of people, calling innocent, honorable, decent people racists and white supremacists, damaging their reputation, deliberately trying to mark them so that they would lose friends or lose professional opportunities or further educational opportunities, using social media to do that, singling out black students who were opposed to what the group was doing for special humiliation, even down to calling them racist names. I think that is what generated the parrhesia, the plain speaking, the blunt speaking of Professor Katz, who really is a surprising person to have engaged in such blunt speaking, because he is not an activist, he's not a political person. He describes himself as a library rat. You know, he's a person who lives in ancient Greece.
No, he's like Professor Watkins in many ways.
That's right. So I completely agree with Cornel, as he knows, about the importance of respectful dialogue.
Yeah.
We have to find the balance.
That's right.
Respectful dialogue, but parrhesia, plain speech, blunt speech, calling things the way they are. And I think it's also important not to coddle people. If you have done something like falsely smear another person, doesn't matter whether you're 19 years old or 26 years old, you've subjected another person to humiliation, you've called or referred to a black student who disagrees with you as Aunt Jemima, you need to be called out. You need to be called out bluntly.
That's true.
We need blunt language.
When you got to have respect all the way in all of its various forms.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about kind of your thoughts on the things you just mentioned. In your Boston Globe piece, you write about the importance of being able to say, no, I will not go along, from the group. And on Princeton's campus, there are a multitude of student groups that see themselves as saying exactly that. And like you just mentioned, Professor West, I know you've publicly supported the Black Justice League in the past, whereas you, Professor George, recently voiced support for the POCC, which is a student group that opposes many of the demands of the Black Justice League. So I'm wondering if you see both of these groups as admirable efforts to divert from mainstream ideology, or do you see one as being more sort of honest and courageous, as you write, than another?
Well, I think both Brother Robbie and I agree that we're against any form of policing. That's true for faculty as well. We're against any form of authoritarian trumping or foreclosing of serious and substantive dialogue. Now, there's a lot of different ways of doing that. It can be from on top by certain, self-righteous liberals. It could be from alongside the conservatives. It could be left, and so forth and so on. But given that commonality, I think it's a good thing that Robbie is being true to what he understands the pursuance of truth and justice are, that he finds himself on that side. I'm being true to myself in terms of my pursuance of truth and justice, and I find myself on the other. I see elements, tremendous, crucial elements in what the Black folk were doing. That was back in 2015, I think. I had already left Princeton. I'd been away, but I still had connections because these were the same causes that I've been promoting way back in 1973. That's how old I am. 1973 and others. But again, it's not, it can't be in an authoritarian way. It's by means of serious mobilizing of arguments and analysis and vision and so forth. And I understand Robbie doing the same thing. I really do. And we wrestle with this all the time together in our brotherhood and friendship and things. But what would you say, though, brother?
Well, yeah, that's right, Cornel. I completely agree. I worry about conversation stoppers for starters. If you're, I have great respect for evangelical Christianity. I grew up around it. I myself am not from that tradition. I'm Catholic, but I grew up in West Virginia in the central part of Appalachia, where most of my friends were what we would today call, we didn't use the term back then, today call evangelicals. But if we move from the evangelical to the more hardcore fundamentalists, often in a debate or an argument, someone would say, well, the Bible says. And while as a Christian, I'm perfectly happy to talk about the Bible and to listen to the authority of the Bible and to treat the Bible as God's word, Cornel and I agree about that. If your answer to an argument is the Bible tells me so, then the argument's over. It just shuts down an argument. It's an argument stopper. We're no longer debating the merits, bringing reason and evidence and argument to bear. We're just stopped by this conversation stopper. The same can be done with accusing somebody of being a racist or a white supremacist. That can be a conversation stopper. Someone's trying to make an argument against your policy view or against your proposals or demands. And instead of listening to the argument and considering whether it has any merit, if you just say, well, you're a racist, or you're making that argument makes you a racist, or you're failing to see that I'm right makes you a racist or a white supremacist. That's just another form of fundamentalism. That's just shutting down arguments, and it does not have a place on a university campus any more than, while respecting anybody's right to speak however they want, any more than, well, the Bible says, has a place shutting down conversation on a university campus. Now, I do think that young people and all people need to speak their minds. And often that will take courage because you can get into trouble for doing that. So to the extent that the students on the left who are making demands are speaking their minds and taking risks, and I'd want to know more about what risks they're taking, but to the extent that they're taking risks to speak their mind, then I say kudos. I might not agree with their policy prescriptions or their demands, but I say kudos to you for speaking your mind boldly and taking risks. I know the students in the Princeton Open Campus Coalition are speaking their minds and taking risks. We've already had a case of a student who's had his job interview canceled by a major business firm, a major consulting firm, Deloitte, because he signed a POCC letter critical of the demands being made by students on the other side. That was outrageous on the part of Deloitte, but it was brought to Deloitte's attention deliberately in the hope that we would have an outcome like this. As I understand the history, I might have it wrong, but I know the basic facts are right, that the interview was canceled because the student had signed a POCC letter. That is intolerable in an institution devoted to learning, where the conditions really have to be that people can speak their minds. And I know that many, many students and alumni and faculty members, and let me put some emphasis on this, Cornel will know what I'm talking about here, and faculty members have been in touch with me to say, I would like to be public in my criticism of the demands either of the students or of faculty members in the July 4th letter, but I can't take the risk. I can't take the personal and professional risk. So one of the things I want to know, Marie-Rose, when we're evaluating whether we've got courage really here or something else, is I want to know what the people we're talking about, whether it's the POCC or the group on the other side, I want to know what tactics are they using. To evaluate them, I want to know not only do I agree or disagree with their substantive views and demands, that's actually less important to me for these purposes. What I want to know is what tactics are they using? Are they trying to shut down speech on the other side? Are they using conversation stoppers? Are they exposing other people to ridicule? Are they exposing other people to false allegations, smearing them, trying to ruin prospect of having friends or getting further educational opportunities or getting future employment opportunities, fulfilling their career ambitions and so forth. And in the age of social media, it's so easy to do that. You can just cancel a person by making these allegations against them online. And as I understand it, that's forever when it's online. I don't understand the technology perfectly, but people can take a screenshot and it's online. And sometimes just the allegation is enough to ruin a person. So I need to know some facts before we make a final judgment about any particular group, whether it's on the right or the left. I can tell you about groups on the right that use bad tactics, and I've condemned them, as Cornel knows. I mean, I've condemned them just as he's condemned the tactics of some groups on the left. And when it comes to standing up and speaking your mind and saying no, which we call on people to do in the statement that we put out, Cornel and I both have direct experience with this. In 2016, after the primaries and on the Democratic side, he was under tremendous pressure to endorse Hillary Clinton. I was under tremendous pressure from the other side to endorse Donald Trump. Neither one of us could do that. I could not in conscience endorse Donald Trump. Cornel could not in conscience endorse Hillary Clinton. But that meant we caught a ton of abuse from people in our respective camps. They accused Cornel of contributing to the election of Donald Trump. They accused me of trying to help Hillary Clinton. I wasn't trying to help Hillary Clinton, and Cornel wasn't trying to help Donald Trump, but neither of us could, in conscience, publicly stand in support and endorse someone who we believed was unworthy of our support. It was that simple.
No,
and so we took the heat.
That's very true.
What you do.
That's very, very true. And I think, we could talk to our dear sister, Shirley Tillman. Of course, I have great love and respect for her. She rescued me from my episode at Harvard, and I'll never forget it. But I think it's clear to say that Brother Robbie and I got to be two of the most misunderstood, misconstrued, lied on, rebuked, devalued, dishonored folk that you could imagine at Princeton, because she used to tell us, I received more letters from you two trying to convince me to revoke your tenure based on your stances politically and so forth. And she was strong, but it was a compliment in a certain sense. We had to check ourselves because out of intellectual humility, we could be wrong about a number of things. But what we're talking about is this moral constancy, to use the language of Jane Austen, the constancy, the consistency that will always already get you in a certain kind of trouble. And it is what it is, but you have to be honest about it, and you have to be courageous without being self-righteous.
While we're on this, I think, Cornel, we here really should say a word of thanks to the folks at Princeton Public Safety, because Cornel and I were both, not only were we the subject of many letters to President Tillman, and no doubt President Shapiro before, and probably now President Eisgruber, but we were subject to many threats, and it required the folks down at
absolutely.
Public Safety to help us and to protect us and to investigate attacks or potential assaults on us. In my case, one was a very serious one, and with the help of campus safety and also the FBI, the person responsible for the threats and the planned action against me spent 3 years in a federal prison, was convicted of making terroristic threats, and ended up there. And I know that they protected Cornel with the same dedication
Absolutely.
they protected me with. So they don't get much credit. We don't think about them. They're there, but we don't think about them much. But this is a nice opportunity to thank them for that service to us personally and to the campus.
Yeah, thank you. I was hoping to, since you mentioned kind of threats, and also going back to what you said earlier about conversation stoppers, Professor George, I'm wondering if, and how you articulated how calling someone a racist can be a conversation stopper. Do you think calling someone a terrorist can also be a conversation stopper in the same way, sort of what
Sure.
Professor West
Sure, it could be. It all depends, again, on context and whether the underlying facts will support the blunt language. So if you have a particular case, we need to know what the facts were. Were the people who are standing under accusation guilty of smearing innocent, honorable, decent people? Did they try to intimidate people, try to prevent them from getting further or future employment or educational opportunities. Yes, that can be a conversation stopper, but we need to know whether the underlying facts support that kind of bluntness. So nobody should offer an opinion, I think, unless they know the facts.
So one thing that, for example, Professor Tracy K. Smith, someone you mentioned earlier, Professor West, argued is in her letter to President Eisgruber, is how in the present climate especially, calling Black students and alums terrorists can incite physical violence against them and incite the sort of death threats BJL alums have already seen. And I'm wondering what you think about kind of the validity of that concern. Professor West, I can start with you.
Yeah. No, I mean, I have great respect for the great poet Tracy Smith. And I know that a number of the Black students were already under ugly threats in 2015. That's why they called me. I was in Atlanta with my son Clifton, and they made their move to the hotel. I think what Robbie's saying is that there's a lot of different conceptions of what a terrorist is. I think when people think of terrorists, you think of the Ku Klux Klan, you think of ISIS, you think of Bull O'Connor, you think of the whole, you can think of in domestic violence where men are terrorizing women physically as well as psychologically and so forth. So that word has a certain resonance that seems to go far, far beyond any conceivable evidence of students taking over a president's office or students bullying fellow students in unwarranted ways, in ways that we need to criticize, in the way in which Brother Robbie's talking about, in the way in which Brother Katz is talking about. Students ought not to be treated that way. I agree with Joshua, I agree with Brother Robbie. But when you use a term like terrorist, then you've upped the ante so that there's a good chance that the response to you is going to be one of upping the ante. And I think Sister Tracy talked about this in terms of race baiting. But see, once you reach that level of hyperbolic language, you're not really having a conversation. You're just having a slug it out. You're just having people just slugging it out. And that's what you don't want. You want a conversation. You want to teach people about ways in which white supremacy and male supremacy and these evils operate inside of us. Now, I do very quickly, I have a different view, I think, of what racist or sexist means. I think that there's white supremacy inside of all of us, including Black folk, including brown folk. I think it cuts that deep in the culture. I think there's male supremacy deep down inside of us. Robbie and I, as Christians, we've got to fight against anti-Jewish hatred, given the vicious history of Jews, of Christians vis-a-vis Jews, and Christians vis-a-vis Muslims. You got to deal with anti-Muslim inside of us. And so when I look at people, I like to say, well, I see you're making an assumption and looking at something through lens that are tilted, that's biased in white supremacist ways. That's different than calling somebody a racist. That's simply saying that you grew up in America. You need to undergo some deep education and transformation. But I say that about Black people too, in terms of when we say things to each other that are just degrading and devaluing in regard to race. Well, there's something inside of us that we got to work on. So that this name calling that trumps dialogue, I agree with Brother Robbie on, but I think we have to be honest enough about our own vulnerabilities to these evils that are inside of us. It can be imperial to think American life has more value than a life in Guatemala, or a life in Kenya, a life in Libya, or a life in Afghanistan, and so forth. Well, the Christian, I don't believe that. I don't believe in that kind of nationalist idolatry when it comes to human life. You see. So that imperial ideology could be inside of us that needs to be wrestled with.
Yeah, but I agree with that. But when you call somebody a racist, and especially when your intention in doing that is to silence them, silence their criticisms of you, and where you are trying to make an example of them, because you know that by marking them with this vile slur,
Right.
will make
Right.
it impossible for them to maintain friendships. People won't want to have anything to do with them. People will live in fear of having anything to do with them. You're trying to ruin their professional futures, future opportunities for education, future career opportunities, and that's what I'm concerned about.
Right.
I
No, I
also
agree with
think
that.
it's
I agree
terribly
with that.
important. We need some acknowledgement that not all black students agree, that there is
Absolutely.
disagreement within the African
Absolutely.
American community generally and in our own society, as there is with any community. And then we have to look at how are the dissenters treated?
Yes.
Are they
That's right.
subjected to smearing and tarring and bullying and intimidation and name calling? We need to get down to facts about that sort of thing. How are they being treated? Are they being terrorized? It's a legitimate question. What are they feeling when they are being singled out, called racist names, all as part of a larger campaign? Now, I don't think that everybody in the group was responsible for that kind of behavior. But there were people in the group, in positions of influence and leadership in the group, that were engaging in that sort of behavior. And now we have to deal with that, and we have to deal with that bluntly and plainly, just as we have to deal with the legitimate claims and objections
Absolutely.
and demands that are being made. So if somebody comes in and says, "Well, this is bad because you're calling black people names," well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. We're talking about a group here that is not all of one mind here. And some of the people who dissented from the larger group themselves were subjected to intimidation, abuse, name calling, including racist name calling. That's where
That's right.
the complexity of the matter has got to be taken into account.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why, again, the examples that we talk about, I know we started with these examples, are very important, because a lot of white brothers and sisters, for example, believe that somehow their whiteness gets in the way, as opposed to their cowardliness, as opposed to their ignorance, as opposed to their lack of exposure. If they knew who Miles Horton was, if they knew who Norman Thomas was, these are towering white folk who struggle against white supremacy because they chose to be persons of integrity and decency. And you see it enacted. It's not just some abstract talk about whiteness in the abstract, blackness in the abstract. You see human beings who are black, white, brown, indigenous, whatever, engaging in quest for truth, quest for justice. Zaid in the same way. He's trained under Harry Levine, a Jewish brother at Harvard. Lionel Trilling runs interference for him, a Jewish brother at Columbia. Edward Zaid never forgot that. His critique of Israel had nothing to do with his hatred of Jews. Jews had embraced him as a human being. But he was wrestling with truth and justice. That's why he could come together with a Chomsky, who's also Jewish, but was tied to his own particular quest for truth and justice. Whether you agree or disagree, it's not about the abstract whiteness or blackness or Jewishness. These things have to be rooted in our humanity and the choices that we make based on integrity, honesty, decency, and courage. So Brother Robbie and I, we don't understand ourselves as persons with white ally, black ally. No, we ain't no language of allyship at all. It's our humanity. It's our reveling in each other's joy and laughter and argument and being wrong and being right and concern with one's kids and concern with one's loved ones. And when I met your parents there at the Harriet Tubman moment of your mother and father, you know what I mean? Good God Almighty, it ain't no whiteness, blackness thing going on whatsoever. It's human beings who are black and white, concerned with something deeper than themselves. That's the best of what we have to offer as a species, let alone the best of Princeton. Princeton has had folk to do this kind of thing. Yeah. We got to keep track of those. And it's not tied to just one ideology in politics or one religion that we see this enacted.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I, as a conservative, as you can imagine, I have my own critique of Said and critique of Chomsky.
No, absolutely.
I've seen Chomsky actually speaking out in some ways I agree with recently.
Well, he's got libertarian
so I surprised myself there.
Oh, God bless him. God bless him. You know, what can you say?
Well, thank you, Marie-Rose. It's been wonderful to talk with my dear brother Cornel and with you.
Indeed, and you enjoy your junior year, returning to campus and online, and we pulling and praying for you, our dear sister.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you both for speaking with me.
Thank you, Marie-Rose.
Thank you so very much. You gave us a lot of time. That was very kind.